you're not going to. I'm going to have to do this here as well.
She's just going to leave you in there.
You're good now.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started.
That's the original.
I'm reminded of that scene in the Electric Horseman where the newspaper reporter, Jane Fonda, is trying to convince Robert Redford that she's actually been to a rodeo, and Redford turns to her and says, you stay to the end, you stay to the rattlesnake roundup, and she says, oh yeah. So you all are here at the rattlesnake roundup. We're about to close down the day. My name's Mike Delaney. I'm a retired lawyer. I practiced over in Kansas City. About 7 or 8 years ago, my wife and I bought an old house in Lawrence. You already heard a little bit about it today because Dorian Hieronymus, who was one of the speakers a couple of panels ago, he and his family actually owned that house for a number of years, about 25 years ago. So, and I had not met him before today. So anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about that house and some of the lessons that I've learned that you all maybe would take advantage of. I have been on the Heritage Conservation Council here for a number of years. I'm also active with the Lawrence Preservation Alliance and a trustee of the Freedom Frontier National Historic Area. Our two other panelists actually do this work for a living. They're not just dabblers like I am. Kristen Johnson is the Historic Tax Credit Specialist with the Kansas State Historic Preservation Office. She's the person who reviews tax credit applications, who helps to work with property owners on what kinds of work will be covered and what might not be covered, is responsible for helping to review the completed work when it's done, and then ensuring that the tax credits are properly allocated to the folks that earned them. And she's going to talk more about the nuts and bolts of the program. And then our third panelist is Brenda Spencer. Brenda has a preservation business, Spencer Preservation, outside of Wamego, and she's been involved in, responsible for helping to prepare hundreds of historic preservation rehabilitation projects. My wife and I were just in Alma, Kansas, the Wabunsee County seat, the other day, and one of the buildings that she's been working with over there, the Limerick building, is just completed a renovation and whatnot. She'll talk a little bit about that project and some of her other work as examples of commercial-sized projects for which tax credits might be available. So with that introduction, I'm going to ask Kristen to talk a little bit about the general scope of the tax credit program and its purposes. One of the reasons it exists is to encourage people to rehabilitate historic properties or properties that are located in historic districts by providing a financial incentive for them to do so. And in fact, one of the things you'll hear from her is that the state has decided to be even more generous than it has been in the past, particularly for property owners who live in smaller communities. So with that, I'll turn the podium over, at least the microphone, over to Kristen, and she can go through some of her material, and then I'm going to come back up for a little bit to tell you a cautionary tale.
Yeah, we've kind of decided to do a little mix it up, and you don't know who's going to talk next, so we'll keep you on your toes here. Anytime we talk about the tax credit, I always like to establish a baseline, explain what it is, make sure we're all on the same page when we talk about tax credits. Our program was created in 2001, and at this point we've had thousands of projects come through. We're over 2,000 in our number system at this point in the 21 years of this program. So it's a very effective program. It's helpful, it's beneficial. People use it and they keep coming back. And we have more buildings taking advantage of it every year. It is one of the best structured and available programs of any state in the country. So you really do have the best of the best around here. Next slide, please. So there are two different tax credit programs. And we're not going to stress too much about the two different ones at this point because different ones apply to different people. I'll go over the basics of the two, but we're not gonna stick on that much today. But what is a tax credit? That's not always understood when people call me first off to find out what funding sources are available. So a tax credit pays the income taxes that you owe. It is different from a tax deduction that causes you to pay lower taxes. Tax credit will pay your tax liability for you. It's a lot like having store credit. If you have store credit at a shoe store and you go in to get a pair of shoes, those shoes aren't cheaper, they're not deducted. You just have this credit that pays for the expense of those shoes for you. So it's the same idea, but with the Department of Revenue or with the IRS. So there is a credit available that you have earned. So when you go to pay your taxes, instead of writing a check and paying those out, then you just enter a little number and the system will tell you, oh, you have credits, those are going to pay this for you. Who can use this program? You have to be an owner of a listed building, and that means that the building is either listed individually on the National or State Register of Historic Places, or it is a contributor to a historic district. So sometimes there's a whole area that becomes listed together because of a shared history or a shared connection. Instead of writing 70 individual research nominations on all the buildings, here's the history, the shared history, and these are the buildings that contribute to that history. So you have to be a contributor within the historic district or individually listed. If you meet those criteria, then you are eligible to apply and use the program. In the session before lunchtime, someone asked, what are the benefits of being listed? Well, obviously, access to this tax credit program, it's been one of the biggest drivers for listing buildings in our state in the past 20 years. And we have had a good history of using this program in some states. Well, this year in Nebraska, their state tax credit program was allowed to sunset. No one looked at it, it had a lifespan and it ended, and no one had put forth to extend it, and so theirs is gone. Thankfully, our legislature is looking at ways to expand it and make it possibly more useful. So you guys really have a good opportunity here. Next slide, please. So there are two different programs that we work with. There's a federal tax credit program that has been around for since I believe the 70s or 80s that provides a 20% federal tax credit, so on your federal taxes. It is for commercial buildings only. And for a long time, this was the only option. But then in 2001, our program was created, which provides a state income tax credit for any listed property. And this includes commercial, residential, civic-owned buildings, nonprofits, churches, schools. If it is listed and it is a building, it is eligible to use these state credits. And that is because our state credits can be sold or transferred. So if you are a church and you don't pay taxes, you can receive your credits, sell your credits to an interested buyer, and be able to see some of the benefits of that. I have a lot of school projects, a lot of church projects. I think nonprofits are probably about 35% of the total number of users of our program, because there is a pretty healthy market for people who like to purchase the credits. Even Baker University uses tax credits for some of their listed properties and is able to sell those credits. So it is a very useful tool for maintenance, for work that you're going to have to do. Here's a way to kind of recover some of the cost of that. You can combine the federal and state tax credits so that if you have a project that will qualify for those federal credits, you are going to be able to do a little bit of extra paperwork at the end and get the state credits too. So you can get up to 40, 45, well now 55 and 60% additional in credits back after your project is done. So if you're putting together a larger, looking at a commercial redevelopment, the high school here in Baldwin City did a historic rehab tax credit project to change it from high school to a housing project. So those are available. If you are considering trying to figure out which program you apply for, I suggest you give us a call and we can talk through that. Because I don't want to put you down the road to doing a federal project and doing additional paperwork if it's not going to work out for you. But for the state program, you have to be spending at least $5,000, which isn't hard on a historic building. Right, Mike? Yeah. Okay, next slide. So we kind of touched on it, but yes, our state did expand and pass legislation that changes our state tax credit. Starting July 1, which is next week, oh my goodness, a credit percentage will be based on the population of your city or township or community. So sorry, Katrina, are we doing by address or location? Okay, sorry, we're still working this out. We got a few more days. But where the building is located, if the population of that township or city or something is less than 9,500 people, you're going to get a 40% credit. If it is between 9,500 and 50,000, which is a lot of communities, your credit is going to 30%. And then everyone else over 50,000 is still going to stay at the same 25%. Unless you're a 501c3 nonprofit, and then you're going to get 30%, which has been the situation since about 2007, I think, when they passed that. So anyway, so there's a shift in the amount of percentages that are going to be happening. So it's a pretty big major change for our state, but it'll be pretty beneficial for encouraging preservation in some of our more rural communities. So we will be administering that. It'll happen on sort of the back end of a project when it's completed and we're issuing the credits. We'll determine that percentage, but we will have more information coming out about this in the next week. So now that we've gone a little bit of the what and where and who, let's have Mike tell us a little bit about the how and why.
Okay, look at the next slide. Yeah, this, I I think this proverb is more familiarly known as the shoemaker's kids always go barefoot. But next, please. When I retired, my wife and I had been looking at old houses around the western Missouri, eastern Kansas area for a while, and we eventually found the Colonel Blood house in Lawrence and purchased it. And we had owned an old house, a circa 1900 house in the Crestwood neighborhood in Kansas City. And Kansas City at that time did not have state tax credit program, so we'd done a lot of work on that house and had not been able to take advantage of tax credits. In fact, weren't aware that they existed. And then we lived in a series of new houses in Johnson County, and while they all required lots of work, like every house does these days, they obviously wouldn't have been eligible in any event. And so when we moved to Lawrence, the idea that somebody might cover a portion of the cost of the work that we were going to do on the house never occurred to me. And we started off with a number of items that were on the exception list that were taken care of by adjustments in the closing costs. Next slide. There was some of the chimneys were in the process of falling apart and needed work done to keep the bricks from hitting people. So we did a fair amount of masonry repair. Kristen, would that have been covered if we had applied for it and it reached the appropriate level?
Yes.
Well, there was probably a couple $1,000s of that work that needed to be done. Next slide. The roof on the back section of the house needed to be replaced, and that was a $3,000 item. Would that have been covered?
Yes.
And the rubber membrane roof that covers the porch of the house, it also needed a substantial amount of repair work to the tune probably of $1,500 or so. Would that have been covered?
Yeah, you're up to about $7,000.
Yeah, so, and this was all money that was changing hands at the very beginning. We had there was a wonderful realtor that handled the transaction who's actually active in the preservation community in Lawrence. I don't know that he ever mentioned anything to us about the availability. And so part of the reason for doing this and similar kinds of educational opportunities is to point out that some of the obvious kind of projects, I mean, this wasn't a historic roof, this was a replacement for a roof that had gone on 25 years ago. Those are all potentially eligible work. Next slide, please. There was also a fair amount of work that needed to be done, and there always is, year after year, on this porch, which is probably the most striking feature of the house. It needs painting, it needs trim, the trim needs to be repaired from time to time. There's always a little bit of woodwork on the flooring that needs to be replaced. Those would all be covered expenses, right?
Oh, yes.
And we've done a lot of those since we bought the house, too. There are a couple of things that we had done to the house that I've learned would not have been covered. Next slide. Fencing's not covered, right?
Nope, not covered.
Okay, next slide. How about the brick sidewalks? Interestingly enough, in the historic neighborhood that our building, that our home is in, the brick sidewalks are identified as a significant feature of the Laureate neighborhood. But as I've learned from my conversations with Kristen here recently, those are not covered expenses to repair. And there was a fair amount of work associated with getting that sidewalk leveled out. How about patios and brickwork and pergolas and those sorts of things?
If it is new construction and separate from the house, it is not eligible.
Okay, well, this probably
This
would
case
not.
is a no.
Yeah, probably a no. The kitchen in the house was perfectly serviceable. It had actually been redone about 20 years probably before we bought the house. The folks that had redone that work had done a really nice job. They'd actually replaced reopened the windows to the original dimensions. They've gotten approval to do that from the city historic resources people. And they've done a nice job on the kitchen. And as I said, it was perfectly serviceable, but my wife was not happy with the butcher block countertop. And so we put in marble quartz countertops, we put in a copper sink, we did some other work, did some painting work. With those expenses, notwithstanding the fact that they're not essential to keeping the house from falling apart, would those have been covered?
Those would have been covered.
And so the stuff across, the same kind of work, the hood, the lighting, the cabinet work on the other side, that would have been covered too?
Yes, it would have.
Okay. And
New
we also...
New appliances would not, but the
Right.
cabinets.
Well, we actually, that would have been a problem because we used the same appliance.
Okay.
We used the same appliance. We also, Dorian, who was here before, his family had put an addition on the house back in the 80s or maybe like 70s that included a big bathroom, large bathroom that had a shower and a stool and a lavatory in it. My wife was really interested in having a powder room, so we divided the big bathroom into a powder room in the front and a shower in the back. We put in this lavatory, new sink, built a false ceiling over the powder room area. Would those expenses have been covered?
Yes.
And the tile flooring that went in and the beadboard and stuff that was put on the wall?
Yeah.
Next slide. When we first looked at the house, we had the fireplaces inspected, and the fireplace inspector ran cameras down and told us that he wouldn't light a fire in those fireplaces, that we were likely to poison ourselves, so we didn't. But we were really interested in being able to have a fireplace, so we found a couple of years ago that you can put fireplace inserts that just run a flexible steel tube up the fireplace for exhaust and another one for intake air, and we put a couple of those in. Would those have been covered?
These would have, yes.
Next slide. The HVAC system works fine, but it was extraordinarily dry in the wintertime, and it had an old inoperable humidifier. We put a new one of those in, and the basement also collected water, and we installed a sump pump. Would those have been covered?
Yeah. Those would have been
Okay, well, you can do the math for yourself. There was enough expense involved associated with these things that it probably would have covered our state tax bill for a couple of years if we'd done this all in one project and then used the credits over a couple of year period. And the message here is that these are common everyday expenses that every homeowner, including new homeowners, but especially old homeowners, confront all the time. And it turns out that an awful lot of these are eligible for tax credits if your property is listed or in a historic district. And if you do the project in the correct order, which is to ask for the approval to start a tax credit project, get it approved, and then do the work in a way that's consistent with this. As it turns out, we were careful. We used the same craftspeople that had worked on the house. It was all done according to the Department of Interior standards, which I didn't know very much about at the time. But the object lesson here is the first question to ask the contractor is, or to ask yourself as you're thinking about contracting for this kind of work, is it possible that we could get tax credits? If we're not already listed, is there a way to get with other people in the community to get a historic district nomination that would include our property as a contributing property? Is there a way to get our individual property listed? There are folks here in the audience that have done that in the last few years, and particularly with rural properties as farmsteads or whereas individually listed properties, and then they've made themselves available, eligible for these things. So
And there might even be grant funding available.
there are, in fact, there are folks in the audience
Yeah.
that have been successful in getting substantial grants from a variety of grant programs that have grant money available for rural preservation projects and other kind of preservation projects. I think that's it for my slides. If not, there may be one more.
Perfect.
Yeah, carpeting is not covered, right? At least this kind that you just tack down.
The tack down kind is not counted, yeah.
But if we glued it,
It would have counted.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen for her to go through. This was sort of a lightning round on potentially covered and not covered items, but she'll take us through in more detail on some of this.
So all work that, the main thing to take away that I need you to remember, this is a great program, we love it, I want Mike to do a bunch more projects. The main thing to remember always is this is a preservation program. You are going to have to preserve something. So you have to keep that in mind when you put this stuff together, that all of the work that you're doing has to meet the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. All plans and specifications are reviewed by the SHPO, and the State Historic Preservation Office. We call ourselves the SHPO because it's easier to say. And if you're doing a federal project, it also goes to the National Park Service as well. It's not a fast process, so make sure you budget a little bit of time to talk and work with us. Work should be reviewed before it begins to ensure that it meets the standards. This is a requirement for the state program, and it is a strong recommendation for the federal program. Only qualified expenses, like what Mike and I talked about, are eligible to receive tax credits on. So the good news is, it is my job to know all of this stuff, to know what the Park Service is going to look at, to know what those standards are, to know what treatments are helpful or not helpful, and how we should put together a project. It's your job to understand that these rules exist and will be applied to your project. So I know the rules, but you have to understand that I'm probably going to recommend some changes or talk about, different ways to do different things. And to be open to that idea too. If you come to me and you have your dream kitchen already laid out and you're tearing off, the back third of your house to make this giant open kitchen, that's probably not going to meet the preservation standards. So it's a preservation program. Come to us with the conversation. And be prepared that we might ask, hey, let's make a change. My goal is to know these standards, but also still meet your needs as a property owner. Next slide, please. So there are things that are qualified and non-qualified. What it breaks down to is anything that is permanently attached to the building, whether it is, quote, historic or not. If it becomes a permanent part of the building, it is eligible to be one of those qualified expenses. We do have this information on our website, so you don't have to stress about memorizing all this stuff. But it is a lot of things that are become a permanent part of the building, but also notice that fees, architect fees, engineering fees, even construction loan interest, some of these things that go into putting a project together, these soft costs are also eligible as well. So you're going to pay those amounts, and when you're done, you're going to get a percentage of those expenses back as part of your credit. Next slide, please. So what is non-qualified? What's the theory behind all that? It's anything that is not permanently connected to the building. A lot of people like to say if you pick up a house, turn it over and shake it, everything that falls out is what's not qualified. Your appliances, your furniture, what else is on here? Curtains, those kinds of things. Those are personal property. You move, you can take those with you. These are the things that are wired in, plumbed in, painted on, or glued on. So a lot of this comes from IRS descriptions of what is a real property to a building versus what is personal property, and then our state has also expanded on some of this information. We do put a lot of this information on our website and make it available if you have questions. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what it's like to go through the process of filling out an application. Don't worry, that's not supposed to be readable. It's okay. It just wants to show you that there's paperwork involved. But I wanted to kind of walk through a case study for, this is the Bell Wilmot House. It's in the Hancock Historic District in Lawrence, and it's 707, 709 12th Street. It's right close to the football stadium. So this property, you can see it was built in 1911, and this is what it looked like in April of 2016. And so when you're starting a project, well, every tax credit project, federal or state, has three parts to it. There's the part one, which establishes the history of the house. If it's in a historic district, it determines that it still continues to contribute to the historic character of the area that it was listed with. And it also helps us establish a baseline of what is in the house and what's historic. This may have been listed in a historic district, but we've never looked at the inside of it. We don't walk through it unless we're invited in to talk about a project. So the paperwork that has to be filled out kind of provides the basic history you can of the house, dates, when things were added or changed. And then you submit photos that show us and document us, hey, this is the starting point on this house. And so this was the starting point on this house. It had been used as university or student housing for years. You can see it's, even from one picture, it's kind of shabby shape. But it allows us to kind of see what we're dealing with and also be able to talk to property owners like, hey, I don't see you have anything in here, you left this out of your application, or do you know when this thing occurred, or do you know when the garage was demolished, those kinds of things. So we can get an understanding of what we're about to see. Next slide, please. And if you could click through about every 5 seconds. Yep, we've got some exterior photos of the house. So this allows me to, and these are a required submission with each application, that we see the outside and inside. It establishes that baseline. And when I look at this, I'm noting things like, what are the materials on this house? It's got shingles as a siding. I'm looking at the roof materials. There's dormers. There's a lot of wood. You can see from the back, it's built into a hill, so it's pretty tall. So there's probably a big solid foundation on that might need some work because dirt and water like to push on foundations. So I'm looking to see, what are we working with? What are we starting with? Next slide. Go ahead. Yeah. So with the part 2 application, that's where you describe what it is you're going to be doing. Go ahead and click through those. So you're going to tell me and show me, so you tell me in writing, this is the project, this is the existing condition, and this is what we're planning on doing. You're going to tell me methods and materials and everything you can possibly think of. But this is where I take the information from the part 1, where I'm learning, okay, what do we have? And then I'm going to look at, okay, what are you wanting to do to this? So for Mike's house, if he's going to work on the porch, okay, I've got a photo of the porch. What is he going to do? Oh, he's going to scrape and paint. That's not damaging, okay, I can live with that. Oh, he's going to tear off the porch and put on something else. That's not preservation, and that doesn't meet the preservation standard. So we're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk about it, see why he's doing this, what's going on, and we're going to try to find a solution that's going to preserve as much as possible. It is important that all of the work you're doing, again, not just the historic stuff, but everything is submitted in writing. because that is what we use to base your expenses off of. If you forget to put the hot water heater in there, but you spent the money to have it replaced, I'm sorry, I cannot count that because it wasn't submitted in writing. So one of the things we do when we look at these is try to make sure that we catch things that might easily get missed. Hot water heaters are the main thing that get missed most of the time. Okay, next slide. Here's a bunch of images that are going to show you what the Wilmot House looked like before. So go ahead and click through as best we can. And so this is, you know, maybe good for students, but not the greatest type of stuff. But this is what we're going to see that's going to show me what's happening. And I'm looking for what is historic and what is not historic. Some of those bathrooms and kitchen cabinets and the kitchen flooring, it's not historic. So if they're going to take that out, I'm not that concerned about it. However, that fireplace that's in the living room, that's kind of a big deal, and they shouldn't take that out. So the photos help me establish what it is that I'm working with and how the scope of what you're doing is going to impact those. Next slide, please. So tips for a good application include all the work that you're doing, not just the historic stuff. I can't stress that enough. We don't want to miss out on money. You don't want to take the time to do the application and then miss out on an expense because you thought it wouldn't qualify. When in doubt, put everything down and see what sticks. Make sure all the items are photographed to the best of your ability. Yeah, it might be hard to get a photo of your roof, but try your best. Don't forget to sign your application when you're sending it in. I would say probably 15% of the paperwork we get is not signed. Please just sign it, it makes it easier. Describe things as best you can and describe the proposed plan. So again, do your best. If we have questions, we will ask. We never outright deny things, we always try to have a conversation about it. Understand that you may be asked to make changes and that it's not the end of the world if we have to tweak something slightly because it might be better for the house in the long run. Remember, this is a preservation program. This is not free money. This is not, you know, we're not just going to give you a suitcase full of money and say, hey, thanks, you're awesome. I mean, that'd be great if someone just gave us money for being awesome. But this is a preservation program. Even if you play the lottery, you have rules you have to follow. So there's nobody's going to give you free money for doing stuff, so you have to follow some rules. And try to submit your application with enough time for review. We do have a good program and it's pretty popular, and we have gotten 20 applications in 1 week before. We strive to look at those within 30 days, but sometimes it gets real messy and it's hard to keep up. But we are trying our best. But if you submit your application on Monday and your guys starting on Tuesday, I don't know that I can get to it in time, but I can try. But you need to kind of take some pity on us and get things in. All right, next slide, please. So this is the Belle Wilmot House after. You can see a little bit of paint, a little bit of foundation work, a lot of foundation work actually on this one. The part 3 is done after the project is done, and you're going to show me those lovely after photos. Yes, and this project turned out very well. This house was kind of unique. There were 2 women who bought the lot, and they built a duplex that was stacked on top of each other, and so that they had built. So there's 4 stories in this. There's a 2-story house and then a 2-story house, and they were not intertwined. But there were 2 2-story houses sort of stacked on each other. Of course, they made them into apartments, 4 different apartments. But it was kind of a unique house, and it was fun to learn the history. There were 2 different sleeping porches. There was garage. As you can see, the one had steps up to the front, and the second one had a little patio in front of their entrance. You had details and kitchens and all sorts of great stuff in each. So, next slide. Here's some of the after photos of the interior. And this is always the fun part, seeing what it looked like after. And I always think college kids don't deserve kitchens that nice, but whatever. Next slide. Oh yeah, here we go. So just to show you, to talk a little bit about this project. This was a bigger project. It used federal and state tax credits. It took about 2 to 3 years to finish the project, and he thought it was going to take $450,000, and it ended up taking $603,000. We know every project ends up being more than what we thought, but the good news is we give credits based on what you've spent. So this project received $121,500 in federal tax credits. So those are going to go pay their federal income tax liabilities over the next few years. And then they received $150,000 in state tax credits that they sold the credits and used the money from selling them to pay off their construction loans. It's a fun little thing you can do. But taking a step back and looking at this from a bigger economic impact, this project created 10 jobs in the local community, which is huge. It generated $128,000 in state, local, and federal taxes, and added $742,000 to the state of Kansas economy, which is more than what the project cost. So it's having an economic benefit that's even greater than what the economic investment went. So this program is a preservation program, but it's designed to have an economic impact. And by the time we issue our credits as a state, that impact, that $742,000 has already been injected into the economy. And that's a really important thing. I'll also throw in that right now with inflation and things cost more and everything costs more, here's a way to help offset those costs. Here's 25% that's going to help you with those costs of materials and things like that, because you have to pay more, but you're going to get 25% of what you paid. All right, next slide. So that last part for the part 3, you want to go back and make sure that you include everything that you did on the part 2. Make sure you have photographs and make sure you've got your expenses together. We always need photographs. Collect invoices and receipts. These forms you see, you're going to fill out your invoices and show us what you spent and confirm that you paid those expenses. And then we're going to use that to help determine those qualified expenses and issue your credits. Credits are issued for expenses paid by the owner. If you have a grant, insurance money covers stuff like that, that is someone else paying that for you. That is not coming out of the pocket of the owner, so those expenses are not eligible for credits. But anything you pay out of pocket definitely is. So that's my specific stuff. I think Brenda's going to walk us through what it's like working with some of these projects on a different perspective.
Okay, next. So we're going to look at 3 quick case studies. I don't do much residential work, so you've got a couple of residential examples, and I know Lawrence, Topeka, Wichita have a lot of historic residential neighborhoods that are designated historic districts. We tend to, my experience is a lot of those projects, particularly in districts, tend to be downtown business districts. So we're going to start out next with, I figured if we were meeting in Baldwin City, I'd try to find an example in a community smaller than Baldwin City. And so I picked Alma, population 989, and the Limerick building was built by the Limerick brothers, is why it's named that. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here, going through details, This one was able to utilize state and federal credits, which you might think is kind of rare, but it's amazing how often that happens, even though they're not spending tons of money, because the buildings just aren't valued highly. Therefore, to meet the federal substantial rehabilitation test, meaning you're going to spend greater than the value of the building, that just defaces, it's not that hard to do. And so here, a former owner had already done the street facades on the exterior, new windows, masonry had been repointed. There were, it's a unique situation where the city hall actually owns the first floor of the corner separately from the rest of the building. So no work was done there, and there was a tenant, a commercial tenant in the first floor of the commercial space. But the second floor had not been used since the 70s, and at that time it was used as a hatchery. There were still feathers up there, but it literally had been used for more than 40 years. So next, you see the vacant second floor. Like a lot of communities, well, regardless of size, housing was a huge issue, is a huge issue that a lot of communities are struggling with, and downtown buildings, second floors of downtown buildings are a logical way to look at addressing that, because you're not building all new structures to accommodate apartments. They were able to create 7 new apartments on the second floor of this building. They combined both historic tax credits as well as moderate income housing grant that they received. And I hear a lot more about low income housing, LIHTC, for large complete building projects. This was the first time I had actually worked with moderate income housing program through the Kansas Housing Resource Commission. And you see here a couple slides on your right of the apartments. And on your left, one of the big challenges is Wi-Fi. And living outside Vigo, I can tell you, a lot of communities struggle with that, whether it's businesses or individuals. And so they have a small co-working space at the front of the building that overlooks the street, and that has Wi-Fi. You can actually rent an office or a desk, or just come in and work for an hour. The incredible thing, in my opinion, is these 7 apartments were leased before construction was anywhere near completion. They wanted to change their phone number because they kept getting so many calls of people wanting to lease the apartments, and they were leased. So I think it's a great example of what a small community can accomplish. I do want to next share one other thing here, and hopefully you can see that well enough to tell me the big difference in the first floor. Kristen, you can see these.
Yeah,
Can you see?
but I can see that, yeah.
Okay. So it was occupied on the first floor. They weren't really going to do any work, in the commercial area, but oops, we have to include, we have to come below the floor structure of the second floor to accommodate the plumbing for the 7 apartments. Plumbing has to slope downhill, plumbing runs. And so, they have suspended ceilings, that's no big deal, and I'm like, oh, no. So, I'm like, if you're gonna take this down to put in plumbing runs, you really need to take time, and we did an amendment, got Kristen's approval, and the soffit, or the plumbing lines had to be boxed in a soffit. But hopefully you can tell the difference just in appearance of this antique store. it's jaw-dropping to walk in there now. The space looks huge compared to the lowered ceiling. So, you know, I don't know what they spent on, specifically on the ceiling. This is one I told Kristen I just finished up yesterday, got the final figures for, and she'll be reviewing the Part 3 very soon. But, you know, I think it's a great example that even if you only wanted to do some improvements to a commercial space, you know, removing a drop ceiling and putting a sheetrock ceiling in at the original plane is a huge way to have an impact on the quality of space. Okay, next, I had to throw in a barn. I had the pleasure several years ago to do the statewide barns survey for the State Historical Society, which resulted in the multiple property nomination for ag-related resources in Kansas, and continue really to have several opportunities to work on barns. One, because I live in a rural area, but also it's just a passion of mine. I grew up in the country, and barns were a big part of my grandparents' land as well as my parents. And I had to put this one in because it's a very atypical project. Stone barn outside Manhattan that actually falls in Wabunsee County. And for those of you that know barns, you'll probably see immediately there's two things incredibly unique about this. One, it has no haymow, and that is not original. The haymow was removed, but it was removed in 1954. It was removed before the current owners who have owned the barn for more than 50 years. And therefore, it really has, you know, it's not something that we would look at restoring because it was removed for a reason at that time, because they couldn't get machinery in, even in the 50s and 60s. The other thing that's incredibly unique, and this was part of the problem, is that the south wall, there's a lean-to on that, a shed addition, and you can see where the haymow was located at the base of that opening, so that you could shovel your hay out of the mow right into the feeding trough in the shed bay that you see on the south. But it was open all the way across, where most barns have a window, a door, or two or three, that you could do that, throw the feed out. But for it to be all the way open all the way across, the vertical structural members, wood structural members, are original. It was built like this. They were hand-hewn, some of them. Unfortunately, the vast majority had failed. Next. And so a big part of it was repairing structural problems with wood members, as well as this west wall of the barn had actually bulged more, almost a foot out of plane. And this was done by Luke Coe, which is a fairly well-known mason. I just think it's one of the best examples because, you know, it's not all coursed. And so it really is an outstanding example where they had to take the stone out where it was bulged, support the stone, then, or support the wall, and then relay it. They did end up adding to the scope of the project to go ahead, and this was based, I think, part on the engineer's recommendations as well as the mason's recommendation, that one of the best things you could do for this was to put doors on it and to get windows back in. And so they did that, and then the project involved a new roof. I think it was $120,000 or something, but that was more, far more than the appraised value of the barn. Therefore, they were able to utilize the 20% federal credit as well as the 25% state credit, and it really made it a feasible project for them because they do still use the barn. It's on a working farm. So I know Douglas County has spent made a significant effort in the last few years to survey rural resources. I know several barns have been listed and utilized historic tax credits And I just wanted to throw in, you know, it doesn't have to be a huge project. You know, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that, you know, $120,000 isn't a large project, but in the world of construction today, it's not. And so to be able to do the roof and the structural repairs was really a huge accomplishment for this couple that had inherited the barn in recent years. Okay, the last one I'm going to look at quickly next is the Stingling Hardware building, and I didn't put this in here so much as a small project example or one of my favorite examples, but it's amazing how many mid-century buildings I have had to deal with in the last few years. As Robert McLaughlin, the tax credit reviewer who recently went over to the Main Street program, always says to me anytime I say bad things about 60s and 70s construction, he says, well, they need love too. So this one is interesting, and the real point that I want to make you think about with this is that when you have a downtown business district, depending on when that nomination was prepared, typically its period of significance of the historic district spans to 50 years ago, which is kind of the maximum if there's no other reason for cutting off the period of significance, and in a business district there often is not. Well, in Manhattan, they had a unique situation with their local historic district and ended up, they weren't qualified for state credits. And so they had to do a new nomination to, they had an early district that was a federal one.
Yeah,
And
it was
I don't
somewhere.
remember all the details.
Yeah.
For federal tax credits. So it ended up in
Was done before our
2007.
state program existed, probably.
Oh, definitely, yeah, it was done in the, with some K-State professors. So once the state tax credit program was in place in 2001, you know, it took a little while for a couple people doing tax credit projects to realize, wait a minute, we don't qualify for federal credits, what are you talking about? So they ended up having to do a new nomination for their downtown district, and I think that was 2007, and 50 years old at that time was 1957. So the period of significance spanned from 1980s to 1957, which incorporated the 40s and 50s when a local architect, Floyd Wolfenbarger, had replaced not just storefronts, but the entire facade on several downtown buildings. So here you have a blonde brick facade. I should have put in a historic photo so you could see the 1880s one, but it's irrelevant because they totally changed the upper window openings at that time. It's not an option to restore the 1880 appearance because the 1880 appearance is long gone. And it has gained significance. This facade has gained significance in its own right. It is specified in the district nomination that this address was contributing as a mid-century building with its replacement facade. And that's really what the point I wanted to make with this one. Next. There were some issues with the storefront with some structural problems and a collapse of a beam that they actually had it supported from system that a truss that they had built on the second floor, and so we had the opportunity to update the storefront, brought it out a little bit, but it still needed to be recessed. You can see they're not butt joints, but they're very, very narrow joints, similar to the aluminum storefront. So the configuration's similar. When we took off the aluminum screens on the upper windows, the original windows were there. And I think that you can see how it's a furnishing company that went in. It really, you know, other than the fact that they didn't spend the money on the masonry repair that I hoped they would, I think that the project turned out great. And you can see the upper left, right photo is they did an apartment and or 2 units, an apartment on the rear and an Airbnb unit on the front that has just constantly stayed leased. So I think it was just, again, a nice refresher in terms of appearance and has been a very successful project for that owner.
Well, and the way the state and federal programs work, the federal program is designed to be a one-time big expense. You're spending more than that value of the building. It's designed for that one-time, major rehab. The state program is a $5,000 minimum. So if they come back next year and are ready to do that masonry work, they can apply for the state tax credits and do a state project on that. So there are projects that are on their 8th or 9th tax credit project in the 20-year history of the program, because you can keep doing that as long as you're spending $5,000, which is not hard to do.
It's not hard to
And I
do.
used to tell people that, it is going to be one time for the federal projects. Actually, I can't say that anymore, but, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I'm now done my 4th building this 2nd time with commercial building with federal tax credits, but they were 15 to 20 years ago. And so, they need new HVAC units. They need new finishes and fixtures in kitchens and bathrooms. And even if they're only doing that, most of the time, with a significant number of units in a building, they can exceed their adjusted basis again because of depreciation over the last 20, 25 years. So I know we're at the end of our time. That's my list. Yeah.
So we're at time, and if anybody needs to leave, go ahead. I want to make a quick plug for how helpful the Historic Preservation Office is in helping to answer these kind of questions. It's not their money. They're eager to see people restore buildings, and if they're able to take advantage of it by using the tax credits, that's great. But there are 2 other things I wanted. One of the reasons why we wanted to do this program this year is because of the impending work that's going to be done here in Baldwin City in connection with the Main Street program. And it was to give property owners here in town an idea about the potential advantages of using the program, and also to dispel some of the notions that gee, that's not something you want to get tied up in, it's all bureaucratic, there's too much work associated with it, it's not worth the payback that comes in the tax credits. But the other thing is to urge those of you who aren't already living in a historic district or who live in a historic property but it's not on one of the registers, is to think about trying to get your property listed. If you want some assistance in that regard, there are a variety of grant programs that may be available to you. The HCC, the county's body that I've been associated with, has made grants in the last few years to a number of property owners to help get their properties on a register so that they'll become eligible for this. And there are other programs available out there. And you can always encourage your community to encourage the county to provide some support for those sorts of things, so that one of the ideas here is to get past the notion that only big developers have this at their disposal. These are available to ordinary homeowners, property owners, and unfortunately, as was the case in our situation, a lot of people don't take advantage of them when they are available. So,
But
anyway.
They just don't know about it.
Yeah.
So, and it's not Kristen's division within the department that does the listing, but it is the same office, and they can help you fairly quickly. It's a fairly easy form called a PSIQ that helps you determine if your building is eligible for listing on the state or national register. So that's kind of the first step we didn't talk about. We focused more on those buildings that are listed or in a district as a contributor. But that just adds another step. The one thing I didn't start with, that I always tell clients of mine, Kristen made the point that, this is a preservation program, you have to preserve. I always tell people, this isn't free money. There are rules you have to follow. You know, I'm not gonna mislead somebody and say, you know, you can do whatever you want. But the reality, I'm a really firm believer in, if you have a historic building of any kind that is listed, and unfortunately, you know, Mike has experienced this firsthand now, you're leaving money on the table if you don't take advantage of this program, because it's designed to do exactly that. Help owners of historic buildings repair, maintain, and preserve the buildings.
I didn't want to, our panelists here committed to be here until 4. I'm going to stay around to answer questions to the extent that either of the panelists is available. We'll be in the lobby, but I know people made other commitments this afternoon. So with that, thank you on behalf of the ACC for coming today. We'll keep looking at this as an opportunity as the years go forward to keep reminding people of the availability of these kinds of tools for folks that are interested in preserving their buildings. Caitlin, do you have anything else you want to offer? If not, thank you so much for coming. We will put our, not only this program, but the PowerPoints from the other programs will be up on the county's website, the same location on the website where the announcement for the program was, so that if you've got information about some of the participants that you want to look at, it'll be there for you.